The rope was a coarse sermon against her skin, a final, undeniable truth. Ilara didn't struggle. The fight had bled out of her days ago, lost somewhere in the cold, indifferent stone of the jailhouse. Now, there was only the raw chill of dawn, the murmur of the assembled townsfolk, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a grave, and the stark, skeletal frame of the gallows against a sky the color of bruised steel. Her breath hitched, a small, trap bird in her chest. This was it, then. The end of a life unjustly condemned, a story silenced before its true telling. The preacher, a man whose face seemed carved from judgment itself, droned on about sin and redemption, his words a dull hammer against the anvil of her despair. Each syllable was a nail in her coffin. She closed her eyes, picturing not heaven or hell, but the wild scent of sagebrush after a rain, a memory so potent it ached. A sudden hush fell, deeper than the previous quiet. Even the preacher's voice faltered, then ceased. Ilara's eyelids fluttered open. A man had pushed through the ring of spectators, his presence a disruption in the grim tableau. He was tall, built like an oak that had weathered too many storms, his face shadowed by the brim of a battered hat. Dust clung to him, the kind that spoke of long roads and little comfort. He moved with a peculiar stillness, a cold intensity that made the air around him crackle. Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority seemed to shrink in this newcomer's presence, stepped forward, hand instinctively going to his sidearm. "This here's a legal proceeding, mister. State your business or move on." The stranger's voice, when it came, was low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a dry riverbed. "I'll take her," just 3 words, dropped into the silence like anchors. Confusion rippled through the crowd. Ilara stared, uncomprehending. Take her where? To what fresh hell? Brody scowled. Take her? She's condemned, sentenced to hang for the murder of Elias Vance. Sentenced to be carried out now. There's an old law, the stranger said, his gaze unwavering, fixed not on Ilara, but on the sheriff. A woman condemned can be spared the rope if an unwed man of property offers his hand in marriage before the noose is tightened. A collective gasp, then a furious muttering. Ilara felt a tremor pass through her, a wild, impossible surge of something that might have been hope if she still remembered what it felt like. The preacher sputtered, "Blasphemy! This is a mockery of justice. And of matrimony." The stranger didn't even glance at him. His eyes, finally, found Ilara's. They were a startling grey, like a winter sky, and held no discernible emotion. No pity, no kindness, certainly no affection. Only a flat, unreadable assessment. "I own the Bar M spread, north of here. Struggling, but it's mine. I'm unwed." He paused, the silence stretching taut. "I'll marry her." Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. This couldn't be real. It was a fever dream, a last-minute delusion before the drop. Sheriff Brody looked from the stranger to Ilara, then to the seething crowd. He was a man who liked order, and this was chaos. But the law, he was also a man bound by its letter, however archaic. "Is this true, preacher?" "Such a law exists." The preacher, red-faced, conceded with ill grace, "It is an old, seldom invoked statute, sheriff. A relic. But it stands." The stranger's gaze returned to Ilara. It wasn't a question, more a statement of intent. "Well, girl? You prefer the rope, or a ring?" His tone was blunt, almost harsh. The rope was a certainty. This man, this offer, it was an abyss of the unknown. But the unknown was still breath, still life. Her voice was a parched whisper, cracked and unfamiliar. A ring. That ceremony was a brutal parody of sacrament, conducted under the shadow of the gallows, the noose still swaying gently in the cold breeze like a patient predator. The preacher, forced to officiate, spat the words with unconcealed disgust, his eyes burning into Ilara with accusations of witchcraft, of ensnaring this stranger, though she hadn't uttered a word beyond her desperate affirmative. The stranger, whose name she learned was Jedediah Thorne when the preacher demanded it, stood beside her, a bulwark of stoic silence. He offered no comfort, no reassuring glance. His hand, when it briefly brushed hers as he produced a crudely fashioned tin band, likely something he'd had for mending tack, was calloused and strong, yet impersonal. Ilara flinched at the contact, her skin screaming from the near-fatal touch of the rope moments before. The vows were stripped to their barest minimum, a legalistic exchange that bound her fate to this grim, unreadable man. "I do," she murmured, the words tasting like ash and disbelief. "I do," he echoed, his voice devoid of inflection. The crowd watched, a collective snarl of thwarted expectation. They had come for blood, for the visceral thrill of a hanging, and had been served this baffling, anticlimactic union instead. Their murmurs grew louder, laced with suspicion and a dark, possessive anger, as if she were a spectacle stolen from them. Jedediah Thorne ignored them all. As the preacher reluctantly declared them man and wife, a pronouncement that hung in the air like a curse, Jedediah's hand closed around Ilara's upper arm. Not cruelly, but with an undeniable firmness that brooked no argument. "We're leaving." He didn't wait for the sheriff's formal dismissal, simply turned and began to lead her through the hostile throng. Men spat on the ground as they passed. Women clutched their children tighter, whispering about the devil's bargains. Ilara kept her gaze fixed on the dusty heels of Jedediah's boots, the only solid point in a world tilted on its axis. His grip was the only thing keeping her upright, a lifeline to a future she couldn't begin to imagine, yanked from the jaws of a death she had already accepted. Fear was a cold knot in her belly, but beneath it, a tiny, stubborn ember of life, fanned by the sheer shock of survival, began to glow. This man, this stranger, had bought her life. The price, she suspected, was yet to be determined. His horse, a lean, rangy roan with intelligent eyes, was tethered nearby, along with a sturdy pack mule. He lifted her onto the mule as if she weighed nothing, his touch brief and efficient, then swung up onto his own mount. He didn't look back at the town, at the receding gallows, at the condemning faces. He just set his jaw and pointed the roan north, into the bleak, unwelcoming expanse of the land. Ilara, swaying with the mule's gait, finally risked a glance behind. The town was already shrinking, the gallows a distant, hateful crucifix. Before her lay only the endless, dusty plains and the rigid spine of the man who was now, by some cruel joke of fate, her husband. The journey was a silent torment, measured in the rhythmic plod of hooves and the vast, uncaring sky. Jedediah Thorne rode ahead, his posture unyielding, a silhouette etched against the pale horizon. He neither spoke nor looked back, leaving Ilara to trail behind on the mule, adrift in a sea of dust and apprehension. The sun climbed, baking the land, and with it, the initial shock of her reprieve began to wear off, replaced by a chilling uncertainty. Who was this man? Why had he done this? No sane man plucked a bride from the gallows out of charity. He was a struggling rancher, he'd said. Perhaps he needed a drudge, a pair of hands too desperate to complain about the terms. The thought sent a shiver of a different kind of fear through her. The landscape was as expressive as her rescuer, stark, unforgiving, beautiful in a brutal way. Jagged hills clawed at the sky in the distance, their slopes sparsely dotted with tenacious scrub. The ground beneath was parched, cracked, thirsting for a rain that seemed a distant memory. It mirrored the desolation in her own heart, a vast emptiness where hope had once tried to take root. Hours passed. The silence stretched, taut and heavy, broken only by the creak of leather, the jingle of harness, and the occasional sigh of the wind, a mournful sound that seemed to whisper of forgotten sorrows. Ilara's throat was raw with thirst, her body ached from the unaccustomed sway of the mule, but she said nothing. Complaint felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. She studied Jedediah's back. The way he sat his horse, easy and commanding, spoke of a life spent in the saddle. The breadth of his shoulders under the worn denim shirt suggested a strength that was more than just physical. There was a containment about him, a self-sufficiency that bordered on isolation. She wondered about the Bar M, his struggling ranch. What kind of life awaited her there? Would it be another prison, just one with a wider yard? As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, painting the harsh land in softer, melancholic hues, Jedediah finally reined in his horse near a meager cluster of cottonwoods huddled by a dry creek bed. "We'll make camp here." His voice, after the long silence, startled her. He dismounted with fluid economy, already moving to tend the animals. Ilara slid stiffly from the mule, her legs nearly buckling. He didn't offer help, but he did unstrap a canteen from his saddle and hand it to her. Water, the word was an order, not an offer. She drank gratefully, the cool liquid a balm to her parched throat. He built a small, smokeless fire with an efficiency that spoke of long habit, using dry wood that seemed to appear from nowhere. The meager meal was hardtack and jerky, eaten in the same consuming silence. When they were done, he laid out a bedroll for himself near the fire. Another, coarser blanket, he tossed towards her. There, it wasn't unkind, merely factual. She was an obligation, a responsibility he had undertaken for reasons still shrouded in mystery. As the stars emerged, cold and distant in the vast, dark sky, Ilara wrapped the rough blanket around herself, the gallows scene replaying in her mind. She was alive. That was the miracle. The cost of that miracle was sitting a few feet away, a man whose thoughts were as impenetrable as the night surrounding them. He was staring into the flames, his face harsh in the flickering light, his eyes holding shadows she couldn't decipher. Why? The word escaped her, a whisper she hadn't intended to voice. Jedediah didn't turn. For a long moment, she thought he hadn't heard or wouldn't answer. Then, his voice, still low, reached her across the small space. Ranch needs tending. Hands are scarce. It wasn't a full answer, she knew. It was a deflection, a wall. But it was something. A practical reason, however insufficient it felt to explain the enormity of what he'd done. Ilara said no more. She lay down, her back to him, facing the darkness. Sleep felt impossible, yet exhaustion eventually claimed her, pulling her into a restless void where the shadow of the noose still lingered. When she woke, it was to the first pale light of another dawn, the air sharp and cold. Jedediah was already up, the fire rebuilt, a small pot of coffee brewing. He handed her a tin cup without a word. The coffee was bitter, strong. Like him. Like this new, precarious life. The day passed much like the first, ending with their arrival, as the sun dipped low, at the bar. Ilara's heart, which had been beating with a fragile, tentative rhythm, sank. Strugglingly had been an understatement. The ranch was a collection of weathered, dilapidated buildings huddled against the vastness as if for protection. The main house was a raw-boned structure, its porch sagging, paint peeling like sunburnt skin. Fences were down in places, the corral gate hung crooked on one hinge. A profound sense of neglect, of a fight long lost or barely waged, hung heavy in the air. This was not just a struggling ranch, it was a dying one. And this, apparently, was her new home, her salvation. The interior of the ranch house offered no solace. It was as stark and unadorned as Jedediah Thorne himself. Dust lay thick on every surface, a silent testament to a life lived without a woman's touch, or perhaps, without care. The main room held a crude wooden table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a stone fireplace, its half cold and empty. A few cast iron pots hung by the side, and a sparsely stocked shelf held tins and sacks. It was a place of function, not comfort, a shelter rather than a home. Jedediah dropped his saddlebags by the door with a thud that seemed to echo in the emptiness. "Bedroom's through there," he said, gesturing with his chin towards a closed door. "It's yours. I sleep out here, by the fire." Mostly he didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The implication was clear, this was a marriage in name only, a contract fulfilled for reasons still obscure. Ilara pushed open the indicated door. The bedroom was small, dominated by a narrow bed frame with a thin, lumpy mattress and a single, threadbare blanket. A rickety washstand holding a chip basin and pitcher stood in one corner. A small, grime-covered window looked out onto the desolate yard. It was a cell, albeit one without bars. Yet, after the jail and the gallows, it was, undeniably, a space of her own, however bleak. She placed her meager bundle, the clothes she wore, nothing more, on the bed. A wave of exhaustion, so profound it was almost physical, washed over her. Jedediah appeared in the doorway, filling it. "There's water in the rain barrel out back. Pump at the well needs fixing, but but the barrel should last a few days if we're careful. Woodpiles low. Animals need seeing to. He wasn't asking for her help, he was stating facts, outlining the relentless demands of this place. I'll help, she said, her voice still raspy. Tomorrow. He gave a curt nod. Get some rest. He turned and left, closing the door quietly behind him, leaving her in the deepening gloom. That first night was a landscape of new anxieties. The silence of the house was different from the silence of the trail. It was a silence that remembered how to breathe, that held the ghosts of past efforts and failures. She lay on the hard mattress, listening to Jedediah's movements in the other room, the scrape of a chair, the soft crackle as he presumably lit a fire, the eventual quiet that signaled he, too, had settled for the night. Sleep was elusive, a skittish creature frightened off by the strangeness of her surroundings and the looming uncertainty of her future. What did he truly expect of her? Was this reprieve simply a deferment of another kind of sentence, a life of thankless toil, bound to a man who was a stranger in every sense of the word? Dawn came, grey and indifferent. Ilara rose, her body stiff, her spirit leaden. When she emerged from the bedroom, Jedediah was already outside, mending a section of broken corral fence with a grim determination. He acknowledged her presence with a slight inclination of his head, then returned to his work. There were no morning pleasantries, no pretense of a normal married life. This was a partnership born of desperation and necessity, and its terms were unwritten but starkly clear. She found the rain barrel, splashed cold water on her face, and then looked around, truly seeing the scale of the neglect. Weeds choked what might have once been a vegetable patch. The chicken coop was dilapidated, its wire mesh rusted through in places. The barn door sagged precariously. It was overwhelming. But inaction was a luxury she didn't have. She started with the house, sweeping away layers of dust, scrubbing the grime from the table and shelves. There was a grim satisfaction in the simple, physical labor, a way to impose a small measure of order on the chaos. Jedediah came in for a midday meal of cold beans and leftover jerky, eaten in their now customary silence. He watched her sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, his grey eyes narrowed in an unreadable expression. She felt his gaze like a weight, a constant assessment. She learned quickly that he was a man of relentless work. From dawn till dusk, he toiled, his movements economical, his energy seemingly inexhaustible despite the meager returns the ranch offered. He fixed the well pump, mended more fences, tended to the half-dozen scrawny cattle that were the sum total of his herd. Ilara found herself falling into a rhythm beside him, unspoken. She cleared the choked garden, finding a few hardy herbs still clinging to life. She patched the chicken coop as best she could with scraps of wood and wire she found. She learned to cook over the open hearth, stretching their meager supplies into bland but filling meals. She saw the scars on his hands, the lines of weariness etched deep around his eyes, the way his shoulders sometimes slumped when he thought himself unobserved. This ranch wasn't just struggling, it was a burden he carried alone, a testament to some past hope now eroded by time and hardship. One evening, as she was mending one of his perpetually torn shirts by the faint light of a tallow candle, she finally asked, "Why me? Why not just hire a hand, if that's all you needed?" He was sharpening a knife by the dying fire, the rasp of stone on steel a rhythmic counterpoint to the chirping crickets outside. He didn't stop his work. "Hands cost money. Money I ain't got. And hands can leave." He tested the blade with his thumb. A wife is bound." The words were stark, pragmatic. Yet, she sensed something more beneath them, something he wouldn't, or couldn't, articulate. Perhaps it was a desperate gamble, a last throw of the dice to save this place that seemed to own him as much as he owned it. Or perhaps, she thought with a sudden chill, it was something darker, a need for control, for a life tethered irrevocably to his. She didn't ask about Elias Vance, the man she was accused of murdering. She didn't offer her story, her pleas of innocence. Trust was a fragile seed, and the soil of their acquaintance was still too barren, too rocky for it to sprout. Weeks bled into a month. The rhythm of the ranch became the rhythm of Ilara's existence, hard labor, scarce food, and the constant, heavy presence of Jedediah Thorne's silence. The initial terror had subsided, replaced by a weary vigilance and a grim determination to earn her keep, to prove she was not a burden, even if her presence was a daily reminder of a condemned past. The trip to the nearest settlement, a place charitably called Progress, was a necessity they postponed for as long as possible. It was less a town and more a scar on the landscape, a handful of weathered buildings huddled around a dusty crossroads, a general store that also served as a post office, a smithy, and a saloon whose faint, tinny piano music sounded like a lament even in the bright afternoon sun. Jedediah handled the horses while Ilara went into the general store, a list clutched in her hand: flour, salt, beans, coffee, precious few bullets for Jedediah's rifle. The storekeeper, a balding man with watery eyes named Silas, peered at her over his spectacles, his gaze lingering a moment too long. "You're Thorne's new woman, ain't ya?" he asked, his voice oily with insinuation. Ilara's stomach tightened. News, even in this desolate country, traveled like tumbleweeds. "I am Mrs. Thorne," she replied, her voice colder than she intended. Silas grunted, then began to gather her items, his movement slow, deliberate. As he weighed out the flour, two rough-looking men sauntered in, their spurs jingling. They reeked of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies. They glanced at Ilara, then exchanged smirking looks. "Well now, Silas," one of them drawled, his eyes raking over Ilara in a way that made her skin crawl. "Looks like old Jedediah finally found himself something besides dust and disappointment up on that wreck of his," the other chuckled, a coarse, unpleasant sound. "Heard he picked her up cheap. Real cheap. Right off the gallows, they say." Ilara's face burned. She kept her eyes down, focusing on a crack in the wooden counter. Before Silas could reply, or Ilara could summon a defense, Jedediah was there, filling the doorway, his shadow falling long and cool into the store. The air seemed to thicken, the jovial menace of the two men dissipating like smoke. He didn't say a word. He just looked at them, his grey eyes flat and hard as river stones. The first man's smirk faltered. The second shuffled his feet. "Just passing the time, Thorne," the first one mumbled, suddenly finding the contents of a nearby barrel fascinating. "No harm intended." Jedediah's gaze didn't waver. After a tension-filled moment, the two men muttered excuses and backed out of the store, their bravado deflated. Jedediah stepped up to the counter, placed a few worn coins down for the supplies. "Anything else?" he asked Ilara, his voice neutral, but his presence was a shield. She shook her head, her throat tight. Silas, who had observed the exchange with nervous interest, hurriedly finished bagging their goods. "That'll be all, Thorne. Good day to ya." Outside, as Jedediah loaded the supplies onto the pack mule, Ilara found her voice. "Thank you," he grunted, not looking at her, securing a sack of flour. Waste of breath, those types, but his intervention had spoken louder than any words of reassurance could have. He had stood for her, however silently. On the ride back to the bar the silence felt different. Less oppressive, more shared. As they neared the ranch, Ilara noticed Jedediah scanning the horizon more intently than usual. "What is it?" He shook his head. "Nothing. Just feeling watchful." That night, as she lay in her narrow bed, she heard him moving about outside long after he usually settled. The faint sound of a rifle bolt clicking into place. The whispers she'd overheard in the store, the men's cruel words about her past, echoed in her mind. But now, they were overlaid with the image of Jedediah's still, formidable presence. He was a man of few words, but his actions were beginning to sketch the outlines of a complex character, a man capable of harshness, yet also of a fierce, albeit unspoken, protectiveness. She was still his prisoner, in a way, bound by a desperate bargain. But perhaps, just perhaps, her jailer was also becoming her reluctant guardian. The thought was a fragile thing, easily broken, but it was there, a tiny spark in the overwhelming darkness. The sky, which had been a merciless, cloudless blue for weeks, began to curdle. Angry grey clouds massed on the horizon, pregnant with a storm that promised more violence than relief. The wind picked up, whipping dust into their eyes, carrying the metallic scent of distant rain and the low growl of thunder. Jedediah scanned the bruised heavens, his face grim. "This is gonna be a bad one. We need to secure what we can. The urgency in his voice was a new note, stripping away his usual laconic demeanor. For hours, they worked against the rising fury of the elements. Ilara, her fear of the storm secondary to the immediate tasks, helped Jedediah reinforce the sagging barn door, her hands raw from wrestling with heavy planks and rusty nails. They moved the few precious cattle into the relative safety of the corral, its newly mended fences now facing their first true test. Chickens were herded into their patched coop. Every loose item around the yard was tied down or dragged inside. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at their clothes, making communication almost impossible. Rain began to fall, first in hesitant drops, then in a torrential downpour that blurred the landscape into a wash of grey. They stumbled back into the house, soaked to the bone, just as the full force of the storm hit. The wind hammered at the small cabin, rattling the ill-fitting window panes, seeking entry like a hungry wolf. Thunder cracked overhead, so close the floorboards vibrated. Lightning split the sky, momentarily illuminating the desolate yard in flashes of stark, eerie white. Inside, the dim light from the newly kindled fire cast dancing shadows, making the small room feel both a refuge and a cage. Jedediah was checking the shutters, his expression tight with concern. Ilara, shivering despite the fire, watched him. In the face of nature's raw power, his usual stoicism seemed to crack, revealing a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. This ranch, this piece of unforgiving land, it wasn't just a property to him, it was a part of him, and its vulnerability was his own. Suddenly, a deafening crash from outside, followed by the splintering sound of wood. Jedediah swore, grabbing a heavy iron poker from the hearth. The barn roof, part of it's gone. Before Ilara could protest, he was out the door, leaning into the teeth of the gale, disappearing into the maelstrom. Panic seized her. To go out in that, it was madness. But the thought of him facing it alone was unbearable. Without a second thought, she grabbed a spare lantern, unlit, useless in this wind, but a symbolic weapon, and plunged after him. The force of the wind and rain nearly knocked her off her feet. She could barely see, the rain lashing her face, the darkness absolute between lightning flashes. Jedediah, she screamed, her voice swallowed by the storm. A flash illuminated him near the barn, struggling with a large section of roof that had been torn loose and was threatening to bring down more of the structure. A piece of timber, caught by a savage gust, swung wildly towards his head. "Jedediah, look out!" He turned, but too late to fully avoid it. The timber caught him a glancing blow on the temple. He staggered, dropping to one knee, his hand flying to his head. Ilara reached him, slipping in the mud, her heart pounding. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, trying to clear it, but she saw the dark stain of blood already matting his hair in the next flash of lightning. "Damn fool thing to do," he gritted out, more angry at himself than the storm. "Help me with this beam. If the rest of the roof goes, we lose everything in there." So together, straining against the relentless wind, they managed to drag the heaviest part of the fallen roofing away from the main structure, preventing further collapse, though the rain now poured freely into one section of the barn. It was a desperate, brutal fight against an implacable enemy. Soaked, muddy, and exhausted, they finally stumbled back to the house. Inside, the fire seemed a haven of warmth and light. Ilara pushed Jedediah into a chair. "Let me see." Gently, she pushed his hand away from the wound. It was a nasty gash, bleeding freely. "We need to clean this." He didn't protest, his usual reserve battered down by the storm and the injury. He just watched her, his grey eyes strangely intense in the firelight, as she fetched water and tore strips from one of her few remaining clean chemises. Her touch was hesitant at first, then firmed with purpose as she cleaned the wound, wincing in sympathy when he flinched. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice softer than she'd ever used with him. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the howl of the wind outside and the crackle of the fire. The storm raged on, but inside their small, battered ark, a different kind of quiet settled. As she carefully bandaged his head, her fingers brushed his temple. He didn't pull away. For a long moment, their eyes met. In his, she saw not the stoic rancher or the silent stranger, but a flicker of something raw and unguarded, pain, exhaustion, and perhaps something akin to gratitude. "You shouldn't have come out," he said, his voice rough. "Could have been killed, so could you," she replied simply, tying off the bandage. "The ranch needs tending, remember." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, so fleeting she almost missed it. "Reckon it does." He leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes for a moment. The fight seemed to drain out of him, leaving him looking older, more weary than she'd ever seen him. That night, he didn't sleep by the fire. After the storm had abated somewhat, leaving behind a sodden, battered world, he rose stiffly. "Might be best if I used the bed tonight." Head spinning some. Elara nodded, her heart doing a strange little flutter. She helped him to the small bedroom, and he sank onto the narrow mattress with a sigh. She turned to leave, to take her place by the fire as he usually did. Elara, her name, on his lips, sounded unfamiliar. She paused at the door. "Stay," he said, his voice quiet, almost a request. "Just till the shaking stops." She hesitated, then slowly returned, perching awkwardly on the edge of the bed, careful not to touch him. The silence stretched, but it was no longer a silence of suspicion or distance. It was a silence of shared ordeal, of a barrier momentarily breached. He didn't speak again, and soon his breathing evened out into the shallow rhythm of sleep, or perhaps exhaustion posing as sleep. Elara sat there for a long time, listening to the dying gasps of the storm and the quiet breathing of the man beside her, a man whose life she had inexplicably saved, just as he had saved hers. The storm passed, leaving behind a landscape scrubbed clean and brutally reordered. The sun rose on a world of glistening mud, downed branches, and the gaping wound in the barn roof. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and shattered pine. Jedediah, pale but resolute, was already assessing the damage when Elara emerged. The gash on his temple was an angry red beneath the crude bandage, but his eyes held their familiar stoic resolve, perhaps tempered now with a new awareness. The work of repair was immense. The barn was their priority, not just for the animals, but for the meager stores of hay and grain it protected. Days were spent hauling salvageable timber, patching the roof as best they could with limited materials, their movements falling into an unspoken rhythm of shared labor. Elara found herself anticipating Jedediah's needs, handing him tools before he asked, bracing timber as he hammered. He, in turn, began to entrust her with more complex tasks, his instructions brief but clear, a subtle acknowledgement of her growing competence. During one of these long days, as they paused for a drink of water, sitting on a fallen log, Jedediah spoke, his voice quiet. "My father built this place. Him and my mother broke their backs on this land." He stared out at the hard, unyielding vista. "She died when I was 10. Fever. Pa, he just sort of faded after that. Drank more than he worked." I tried to hold it together as Elara listened, silent, sensing the weight of years in his words. This wasn't just a ranch, it was a legacy, a burden of filial piety. When he passed, it was already half gone to ruin. Been fighting a losing battle ever since. He picked up a stone, turned it over and over in his calloused fingers. Came back here after I'd been away a long time. Thought maybe I could make it right. For them. The way where? Elara asked gently. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, the light in his eyes dimming. Places I don't talk about. Doing things I ain't proud of. He tossed the stone away. Man makes choices. Sometimes, there ain't no good ones. Just the ones you can live with. His gaze met hers, direct and shadowed. Like you, I suppose. You made a choice that led you to that gallows. It wasn't an accusation, more a statement of shared experience, of lives lived on the jagged edges of survival. Elara's breath caught. He was inviting her story, not with probing questions, but with a shared vulnerability. She looked down at her hands, hands that had scrubbed floors, mended clothes, hauled timber. Hands that were accused of taking a life. Elias Vance, she began, her voice low, he wasn't a good man. He owned the boarding house where I worked. He had expectations of the girls who worked for him. Expectations I wouldn't meet. She paused, the memory still raw, shameful. One night, he cornered me. He was drunk, angry. I fought back. There was a struggle. He had a letter opener on his desk. I just wanted him to stop. He felt her voice trembled. He fell, and the letter opener, it went into his chest. I didn't mean to kill him. I swear it. But no one would believe a serving girl over a man like Vance. His family is powerful. They wanted someone to blame. Quickly Jedediah listened, his expression unreadable, but his stillness was absolute. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge. When she finished, a profound silence settled between them, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. So, self-defense, he said finally, his voice flat. They called it murder and the law agreed with them, Elara said bitterly. The law, Jedediah snorted, a dry, mirthless sound. The law is what powerful men say it is. Not always what's right. He stood up, brushing dirt from his trousers. Story don't change what's done. But it changes how I see the telling of it. He offered her a hand up. His grip was strong, steady. As their fingers touched, a current passed between them, a spark of understanding that went deeper than words. He believed her. Or, at least, he believed in her right to her own truth. That evening, the silence in the small cabin felt less like an emptiness and more like a space being carefully cleared. Jedediah spoke more than he had in all the preceding weeks, not about his past, not yet, but about the ranch, about the stubbornness of the land, about the small victories and frequent defeats. He told her about a particular hawk that nested in the tall pines to the east, about the way the light changed on the distant mesas at sunset. Elara, in turn, found herself sharing small memories of her childhood, before her parents died, before she had to make her own way in a world that was often cruel to a lone woman. They were like two solitary trees, their roots slowly, tentatively intertwining in the harsh soil of their shared existence. One night, weeks later, Elara woke from a nightmare, heart pounding, the image of Elias Vance's face vivid and terrifying. She sat bolt upright in bed, gasping for air. A floorboard creaked in the main room. Jedediah appeared in her doorway, a silhouette against the faint moonlight trickling through the window. You all right? His voice was low, concerned. She couldn't speak, just shook her head, tears welling. He came further into the room, sat on the edge of her bed, just as she had done for him after the storm. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a comfort. Bad dreams? She nodded, finally finding her voice. Always the same one, Vance. She nodded again. He was silent for a moment. Then, I get M too. Different faces, different reasons. But they all want something. He paused. Sometimes it helps to know you ain't the only one fighting ghosts in the dark. He reached out then, his calloused hand covering hers where it lay clenched on the thin blanket. His touch was warm, surprisingly gentle. You ain't alone in this, Elara. The words, simple as they were, resonated deep within her. He understood. He, too, was haunted. The wall between them, already cracked, crumbled a little further. In that moment, he wasn't just her rescuer, her reluctant husband, or the master of this struggling ranch. He was a fellow traveler in the wilderness of memory and regret, a kindred spirit forged in hardship. And for the first time since she'd stood on those gallows, Elara felt a flicker of something that might, one day, become peace. The fragile peace they had begun to build was shattered by the arrival of dust on the horizon, a plume too deliberate, too purposeful to be the wind. Jedediah saw it first, his body tensing like a drawn bowstring. He'd been mending tack near the corral, Elara hanging freshly washed clothes on a makeshift line, a small domestic victory in their hardscrabble life. Riders, he said, his voice flat, devoid of its recent softness. 3 of them. Coming fast. Elara's heart leaped into her throat. Instinctively, she knew this wasn't a friendly visit. In this isolated country, unexpected riders often meant trouble. Jedediah was already moving, his strides long and urgent. Get inside. Stay away from the window. He grabbed his rifle from where it always leaned just inside the door. He checked the load, his movements economical and deadly serious. Elara hurried into the cabin, her hands trembling. She peered through a tiny crack in the shutter, watching as the 3 riders drew closer. They were hard-looking men, armed, their faces grim. One, a portly man with a florid face and cruel eyes, seemed to be the leader. She didn't recognize them, but a cold dread settled in her stomach. They reined in their horses a short distance from the cabin, their expressions arrogant, expectant. Jedediah stepped onto the porch, rifle held loosely at his side, but ready. "State your business," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. The portly man smirked. "Business is with the woman, Thorn. The murderess. Ilara Sims, or whatever name she's using now," Ilara gasped. "Vance's people. They had found her." "She's my wife," Jedediah stated, his tone unyielding. "Law says so." "Law's a funny thing out here, Thorn," the man sneered. "We represent a different kind of justice. Elias Vance was our kin. His blood calls for blood." Another rider, younger, with mean eyes, spat on the ground. "We heard you snatched her from the noose. Figured you were keeping her warm for us." Jedediah's knuckles were white where he gripped the rifle. "She's under my protection. You turn your horses and ride out." Now the leader laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Protection? This rundown heap of dirt ain't gonna protect nobody. We're taking her, Thorn. One way or another. You can die with her, or step aside." Ilara watched in terror. This was it. The past had caught up, a relentless hound. She saw Jedediah's shoulders set. He wasn't going to step aside. He was going to fight for her, for a woman he barely knew, a woman who had brought nothing but trouble to his door. "Last chance," Jedediah said, his voice dangerously low. Ryder the leader's smirk vanished. "Boys," he said, reaching for the pistol at his hip. "Let's collect what's ours." Time seemed to slow. Ilara saw the glint of sun on metal as the man's hand moved. She saw Jedediah raise his rifle, smooth and fast. The crack of the shot was deafening, echoing across the empty land. The leader cried out, clutching his shoulder, his pistol clattering to the ground. Before the other two could react, Jedediah had levered another round into the chamber. "Next one won't be a warning," he roared, and there was something terrible in his voice now, a hint of the man he'd been in those places he didn't talk about. The two remaining riders hesitated, their bravado deserting them in the face of Jedediah's cold fury and deadly aim. Their leader was cursing, bleeding, his face contorted in pain and surprise. "You'll pay for this, Thorn," he snarled, but there was no conviction in his voice. "Get out of here," one of his companions urged, already turning his horse. "He ain't bluffing." Reluctantly, supporting their wounded leader, the men retreated, casting venomous looks back at the lone figure on the porch. They rode off, not fast, but with a clear intent to depart, their threats fading into the vastness. Jedediah didn't lower the rifle until they were distant specks on the horizon. Then, he slowly, almost wearily, let the barrel drop. He turned and came back into the cabin, his face pale beneath its usual tan, his eyes still holding the storm of the confrontation. Ilara rushed to him. "Are you all right?" "They didn't. Just a scratch on my pride, maybe," he said, a grim attempt at a smile. He leaned the rifle by the door, then sank heavily into a chair, the adrenaline draining away, leaving him looking exhausted. "They'll be back," Ilara whispered, the fear still coiling within her. "Or they'll send others, maybe," Jedediah conceded. He looked at her, his gaze searching. "You could leave, you know. Head west. Change your name again. Might be safer for you." Ilara stared at him. "Leave? After this? After he'd stood against armed men for her?" The thought was a betrayal. "And what about you?" she asked. "They know who you are. They know where you live. They'll come back for you too." For interfering, he shrugged, a gesture of weary fatalism. Always someone coming back for something. She knelt before him, taking his rough, calloused hands in hers. They were trembling slightly. "I'm not leaving, Jedediah. Not unless you make me." His eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw a flicker of surprise, and something else, something that looked like a fragile, dawning hope. "This ain't your fight, Ilara. You made it my fight when you stood on that porch," she said fiercely. You made it our fight. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face. A long silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions, with the echoes of gunfire and the grim promise of future threats. "Reckon I did," he said at last, his voice hoarse. He squeezed her hands, a brief, firm pressure. "Reckon we're in this together." Then the words were simple, but they forged a bond stronger than any preacher's pronouncement. They were no longer just a man and a woman bound by an archaic law and desperate circumstance. They were partners, facing a common enemy, their fates irrevocably entwined. The shadow of the gallows had been replaced by the shadow of vengeance, but this time, Elara was not alone. And in Jedediah's quiet strength, in his unwavering resolve, she found a courage she hadn't known she possessed. The days that followed were steeped in a tense anticipation. Every distant dust devil, every coyote's howl, sent a jolt of apprehension through Elara. Jedediah was quieter than usual, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his rifle never far from his hand. He worked with a grim, focused energy, reinforcing the cabin's weak points, checking his dwindling supply of ammunition. He was preparing for a siege, for a fight he seemed to accept as inevitable. Elara moved through her chores with a similar sense of urgency, her earlier, tentative steps towards domesticity now imbued with a desperate purpose. She stockpiled water, preserved what little food they could, her mind racing with strategies for survival. The shared danger had stripped away the last vestiges of their reserve. They spoke more freely now, not of love or affection, those were words too delicate for their harsh reality, but of practicalities, of fears, of the grim possibilities that lay ahead. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence heavy with unspoken anxieties, Jedediah began to speak of his past, not in vague allusions, but with a stark, unsparing honesty. He told her of his years as a bounty hunter, a life chosen in bitterness after his father's decline, a path that had led him into dark territories of the human soul, his own included. He spoke of men he had hunted, men he had killed, of the corrosive effect it had on him, the way it had hollowed him out, leaving him with a weariness that went bone deep. "I came back here," he said, his voice low, "thinking I could wash it all off. Thinking if I worked the land, I could maybe grow something clean again. But the past, it has long shadows." Elara listened, her heart aching for the pain he carried, for the choices he'd felt compelled to make. She saw now the source of his stoicism, his haunted eyes, his reluctance to connect. He was a man who believed himself tainted, unworthy of peace. "You saved my life, Jedediah," she said softly, when he fell silent. "Whatever you've done, whatever shadows you carry, you saved me. That's a clean thing." A good thing. He looked at her, his gaze intense, searching. "Maybe," he conceded, a flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes. "Or maybe I just traded one condemned soul for another." "No," she insisted, her voice firm. "You gave me a chance. You gave us a chance." Their shared vulnerability became a strange kind of strength. Knowing the worst of each other, or at least, the painful truths, seemed to forge a deeper, more resilient bond. They were two damaged souls, finding a precarious shelter in each other's company. The attack, when it came, was not the direct assault they had half expected. It began with fire. One moonless night, Elara woke to a smell of acrid smoke, a terrifying orange glow flickering against the bedroom window. "Jedediah! Fire!" she screamed, scrambling out of bed. He was already moving, grabbing his rifle and a water bucket. The barn was ablaze, flames licking greedily at the dry timber, roaring defiance against the dark sky. "Vance's men," Jedediah gritted out, his face a mask of fury. "Trying to smoke us out, draw us into the open." The heat was intense, even from the cabin. Their precious hay, their meager stores, the structure itself, all turning to ash. Helpless rage surged through Elara. This wasn't just a barn, it was their livelihood, their fragile hope. As they watched, horrified, figures emerged from the darkness, moving towards the cabin, using the inferno as cover. "They're coming," Jedediah said, his voice grim. "Get down. Stay low." Gunfire erupted. Bullets thudded into the log walls of the cabin. Jedediah returned fire, aiming carefully, making each shot count. Elara, huddled below the window line, reloaded his spare rifle, her hand surprisingly steady despite the terror that clawed at her. She had faced death once, she would face it again, but this time, not alone. The fight was desperate, chaotic. The roar of the fire, the crack of rifles, the shouts of the attackers, all merged into a hellish symphony. Jedediah fought with a cold, deadly efficiency, a man transformed by battle, his movements precise, his aim true. Ilara, watching him, felt a surge of fierce pride, and a desperate fear for his life. One of the attackers, bolder than the rest, made a rush for the porch. Jedediah's rifle barked. The man cried out, stumbling back into the shadows. But there were too many. They were slowly being pinned down, the fire at their backs, the enemy pressing in. "We can't stay here," Jedediah said, his voice strained. "They'll burn the cabin next." He glanced at her, his eyes filled with a grim resolve. "There's a dry wash behind the ridge, west of here. If we can make it there, we might have a chance to circle around them, or at least escape into the broken country." It was a desperate gamble. To leave the relative safety of the cabin meant exposing themselves to open fire. But to stay meant certain death. "I'm with you," Ilara said, her voice tight but firm. "Now," Jedediah commanded. He laid down covering fire, forcing the attackers to duck. Ilara scrambled out the back door, into the smoky, treacherous darkness, Jedediah following close behind, firing as he retreated. They ran, bent low, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. Bullets whined past, too close. Ilara stumbled, her ankle twisting beneath her. She cried out, a sharp intake of breath. Jedediah was there instantly, hauling her up. "Can you walk?" She tried to put weight on it, a searing pain shooting up her leg. I don't know, no time," he gritted. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms, his strength astonishing despite his lean frame. He ran on, carrying her as if she weighed nothing, his breath coming in ragged gasps, the rifle still clutched in one hand. Ilara clung to him, burying her face against his chest, the smell of smoke, sweat, and gunpowder filling her senses. She could feel the frantic beat of his heart against her cheek. They reached the edge of the dry wash, plunging into its shadowy depths just as their pursuers crested the ridge behind them. Jedediah didn't stop. He pushed on, deeper into the rugged terrain, the uneven ground making his progress agonizingly slow. Finally, finding a small alcove shielded by rocks, he gently set her down. He was panting, sweat pouring down his face, but his eyes were alert, scanning their back trail. "They won't follow us far into this, not at night," he said, his voice raspy. "Too easy to get lost, or walk into an ambush." He knelt beside her, examining her ankle in the faint starlight. It was already swelling. "Broken, you think?" she whispered. "Sprained, most likely." Badly. He tore a strip from his already tattered shirt, binding it tightly. His touch, even in this desperate moment, was surprisingly gentle. "We rest here till first light. Then we figure out what's next." Ilara looked back towards where their ranch lay. The orange glow of the fire still painted the underside of the clouds, a funeral pyre for their brief, embattled life there. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of loss, of fear, of an overwhelming gratitude for the man beside her. "Everything, it's all gone," she choked out. Jedediah put an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "Not everything, Ilara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We're alive." That's something. He held her tightly, and she leaned into his strength, finding a strange solace in the desolate landscape, under the cold, indifferent stars. They had lost their ranch, their meager possessions, but in the crucible of fire and battle, something else had been forged, a bond of fierce loyalty, of shared survival. And as she listened to the steady rhythm of Jedediah's breathing, Ilara knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. Their fight for a place in the world, it seemed, had only just begun. Dawn broke, painting the stark landscape in hues of grey and rose. The fire at the Bar M had died down to a smouldering ruin, a black scar on the land. Ilara's ankle throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but the terror of the night had given way to a cold, clear resolve. Jedediah, his face smudged with soot and etched with exhaustion, had kept watch through the remaining hours of darkness. His gaze, when it met hers, was heavy with unspoken sorrow for their loss, but also with an unwavering determination. "They'll expect us to run," he said, his voice still hoarse. "Keep heading west, try to lose ourselves in the territories." Ilara looked at him. "Is that what you want to do?" He was silent for a moment, staring towards the distant, smoking remains of his heritage. "What I want," he said slowly, "is to stop running. What I want is a place where we don't have to look over our shoulders every damn minute." "But wanting don't make it so," he sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "Those men, they're from the Vance clan. They're rich, they're powerful, and they're vengeful. They won't give up easy." "Then we don't either," Ilara said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. She thought of the gallows, of the endless fear. She thought of the small, tentative moments of peace she had found with this man, in that desolate place. She wouldn't let them be extinguished so easily. "We can't go back to the ranch, not now. But we can't just let them drive us into the wilderness like hunted animals." Jedediah looked at her, a flicker of surprise, then a slow, approving nod. "Got a plan, then, Mrs. Thorne?" The Mrs. Thorne still sounded new, yet it fit, somehow. "Not a full one," she admitted. "But I know one thing. Men like that, they draw their power from fear, from thinking they're untouchable. What if they weren't?" He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on. They came for me, for what they think I did to Elias Vance. But you stood in their way. Now they want you too. What if we took the fight to them? Not just defending, but accusing." Jedediah considered this. "They have the law, or what passes for it, on their side. At least back in that town, but maybe not everywhere," Ilara pressed. "Elias Vance, he wasn't just cruel to me. There were other girls, other people he wronged. What if there are others who would speak out, if they felt safe enough? What if we could find a lawman, somewhere further afield, someone not in Vance's pocket?" It was a long shot, a desperate hope. But it was better than fleeing endlessly. Jedediah was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on some distant point. The fight last night had reawakened something in him, the old instincts, the strategist. But Ilara's words sparked a different kind of fire, not just for survival, but for justice, however slim the chance. "It's a fool's errand, most likely," he said at last. "Dangerous. More dangerous than running." He met her eyes. "But I'm tired of running, Ilara. And I'm tired of them thinking they can just take whatever they want, destroy whatever they please." A grim smile touched his lips. "All right. We fight. Not just with guns this time, but with truth, if we can find anyone willing to listen to it." Their first task was survival. With Ilara's injured ankle, travel was slow and painful. Jedediah fashioned a crude crutch for her, and supported her himself, his strength a constant reassurance. They moved carefully, avoiding open country, sticking to the cover of ravines and wooded areas. They had little food, no water beyond what was in their canteens. But they had each other, and a shared, desperate purpose. Days later, they stumbled into a tiny, almost forgotten mining encampment, nestled deep in the mountains. It was a place of last chances, populated by men and women as rugged and weathered as the landscape itself. Here, away from the Vance family's immediate influence, they found a tentative respite. Jedediah, using skills from his past, took on work guarding a small, sputtering gold claim, earning them enough for food and a roof over their heads in a drafty, abandoned shack. Ilara, her ankle slowly healing, began to make discreet inquiries. She spoke to the women of the camp, women who understood hardship, who knew what it meant to be vulnerable. And slowly, carefully, she began to tell her story, not as a plea for pity, but as a search for solidarity. She found it, in small, hesitant measures. A woman who had worked for a cousin of Vance, who spoke of his cruelty. A man who had lost his land to Vance's predatory dealings. Small stories, whispers of injustice, but together they began to form a pattern. Jedediah, meanwhile, used his own, darker contacts. Men he had known from his bounty hunting days, men who operated on the fringes of the law, but who knew things, heard things. He was looking for leverage, for a weakness in the Vance armor. It was a slow, painstaking process, fraught with danger. There were times Elara despaired, times Jedediah's past threatened to drag them back into the shadows. But the memory of the burning ranch, of their desperate flight, fueled their resolve. And the quiet moments they stole together, a shared meal, a rare, unguarded smile, his hand finding hers in the darkness, these became their true sustenance. One evening, months later, a weary but triumphant Jedediah returned to their small shack. He carried a worn leather satchel. "I found him," he said, his voice tight with suppressed excitement. "A marshal, 2 territories over. Name of Isaac Quill. They say he's hard but fair. And he owes me a marker." From way back he opened the satchel. Inside were sworn affidavits, painstakingly collected, detailing Elias Vance's abuses, his shady dealings. And more, the evidence, pieced together by Jedediah's relentless digging, suggesting that Elias Vance's death might have been more convenient for certain members of his own family than they let on, that Elara had been a perfect, helpless scapegoat. "It's not proof of your innocence, not yet," Jedediah said, his eyes burning into hers. "But it's enough to cast doubt. Enough, maybe, to make a real lawman listen." Elara looked at the papers, at the hope they represented. It was a fragile thing, this chance at justice, but it was real. She looked at Jedediah, at the lines of exhaustion on his face, the unwavering determination in his eyes. He had done this for her, for them. He had faced his own ghosts, used the very skills he despised, all to clear her name, to fight for their future. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. He simply took her hand, his grip strong and sure. "We're not done yet, Elara. Not by a long shot. But for the first time, I think we might just have a chance to build something that fire can't touch." He smiled then, a true, open smile that transformed his harsh features, making him look younger, almost peaceful. And in that smile, Elara saw not just the promise of a new beginning, but the hard-won truth of their journey, that even in the deepest darkness, hope could take root, and love, in its fiercest, most resilient form, could bloom. The gallows seemed a lifetime away. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and a fight for justice. But they would face it together, 2 souls no longer just surviving, but striving, bound by a love forged in fire and tempered by a shared, unyielding resolve.